They took nothing from her except dignity, and somehow that was the one thing the town decided she did not deserve to keep. It happened just after noon, when the sun sat high enough to bleach the color out of the wooden storefronts and leave Main Street looking older than it already was, and Margaret Hale stood at the counter of the general store with a single coin resting in her palm, waiting to be acknowledged. She had been waiting a while, long enough for the men behind her to clear their throats, long enough for the shopkeeper to finish a conversation that did not include her, long enough for the silence to feel intentional. When he finally looked at her, it was not with surprise, but with recognition, the kind that carried a decision already made. He did not raise his voice. He did not curse. He only slid her coin back across the counter with 2 fingers, slow and deliberate, as if teaching a lesson. "We don't serve your kind on credit anymore," he said, though she had not asked for credit, and the word kind hung in the air heavier than any insult. A few men smiled. One chuckled into his beard. No one objected. Margaret closed her hand around the coin, the metal warm from her skin, and nodded once, because arguing would have given them something else to take. She turned away without haste, her boots sounding steady against the floorboards, and stepped back into the glare of the street, where the wind carried dust and the faint smell of horses. Across the road, Ethan Caldwell had seen the entire thing. He had not been close enough to hear the words, but he did not need to. He saw the way the coin was returned, the way Margaret's shoulders stiffened for half a second before settling again, the way the men leaned in toward each other as if something amusing had just occurred. Ethan stood beside his wagon, one hand resting on the worn wood, the other holding the list he had come to town with, now forgotten. He did not move. He did not speak. People who mistook silence for agreement had never learned the difference between patience and indifference. Margaret passed him on her way down the street, her eyes fixed ahead, her face composed in the way only someone practiced at endurance could manage. She did not look at him, and he did not call out to her, because attention, even kind attention, could feel like another exposure. The moment stretched, then snapped back into motion as the town resumed itself, boots scuffing, doors opening, voices rising again as if nothing of importance had occurred. To most of them, it hadn't. It was a small thing, a refusal, a reminder of place, the sort of cruelty that left no mark you could point to later. Ethan folded his list and tucked it into his coat pocket. He watched the general store door, the way it swung closed and settled, and he noted who stood where, who laughed, who looked away. He took his time climbing onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins, feeling the familiar weight of choice settle in his chest. Justice, he knew, did not always announce itself. Sometimes it waited. Sometimes it followed quietly, like a shadow that lengthened when the sun began to move. The town of Red Willow had been built to endure, not to forgive, and its streets reflected that truth in every warped plank and sun-cracked window frame. It sat nearly 30 miles from the nearest rail spur, far enough that the outside world arrived slowly and left even slower, bringing news months late and taking mistakes with it when it went. People here learned early that reputation mattered more than accuracy, and that memory could be shaped by whoever spoke the loudest. Red Willow did not consider itself cruel. It preferred words like practical and realistic, terms men used when they wanted their choices to sound inevitable. Most of the buildings leaned slightly, as if tired of holding themselves upright against the plain's wind, and most of the people carried that same lean in their posture, a forward tilt that suggested endurance, but also a willingness to let things slide if stopping them required effort. Margaret Hale had lived on the edge of that tolerance for 3 years, ever since her husband had been lowered into the ground just east of town with a service so brief it felt unfinished. She rented a narrow house no one else wanted, its back wall facing open land where the grass grew stubborn and thin, and she earned what she could by sewing and mending, careful never to ask for more than what was offered. She knew which sidewalks to cross and which conversations to leave before they turned. The refusal at the general store was not the first slight she had absorbed. Only the most public, and public moments had a way of settling into the bones. Ethan Caldwell lived farther out, past where the road gave up pretending to be maintained and turned into rutted earth. His ranch spread across a modest section of land. He worked alone, a place measured not by fences, but by how long it took the sun to reach certain hills. He came into Red Willow once every 2 weeks for supplies, never lingering longer than necessary. Not because he disliked people, but because towns had a habit of deciding things about a man without asking. Ethan paid his accounts on time, spoke when spoken to, and kept his eyes open. He had learned that last habit young, back when his father taught him that watching quietly often revealed more than asking questions. In Red Willow, the unspoken rules were as fixed as the church schedule. Men with property were listened to. Women without it were expected to be grateful. Kindness existed, but it was considered a personal indulgence, not an obligation. That afternoon, after Margaret left the store, the story of what happened adjusted itself as it traveled. By the time it reached the saloon, it was no longer about a coin or a refusal, but about someone who needed to learn her place. No one mentioned her name with sympathy. No one corrected the details. The town settled into a version of events that allowed everyone to remain comfortable. Ethan heard pieces of it as he loaded feed and nails, fragments of laughter and assumption drifting on the warm air. He said nothing, because speaking too soon often ended a thing before it revealed its full shape. When he drove his wagon back onto the road, the sun had begun its slow descent, stretching shadows across the ground until buildings and people alike looked longer than they truly were. In Red Willow, evening had a way of exposing outlines that daylight politely ignored, and Ethan understood that whatever followed would not announce itself loudly. It rarely did. Margaret Hale did not cry when she reached her house, not because she was strong in the way people like to praise, but because tears felt like something that belonged to a private life she no longer trusted herself to have. She set her basket on the narrow table by the door, smoothed the front of her dress as if she were still in public, and stood listening to the quiet settle back into the small rooms. The house answered with familiar sounds, the soft tick of cooling wood, the faint rustle of wind pressing against the back wall where the boards did not quite meet. She moved with care, the way someone does when every motion costs a little more than it should, and poured water from the pump jar into a tin cup, taking a measured sip before setting it down untouched. The coin from the store lay heavy in her pocket, not for its value, but for what it had been turned into. Proof that even the smallest exchanges could be made to feel like a judgment. Margaret had learned early how to make herself smaller without disappearing, how to keep her voice even and her requests simple, how to accept refusals without turning them into confrontations. After her husband died, she discovered that grief came with instructions no one bothered to explain, that a woman was expected to mourn quietly and then remain useful, grateful for whatever tolerance was offered. Red Willow tolerated her. It did not welcome her. She sat at the table and took out the sewing she had been working on, a shirt that belonged to a man who never looked her in the eye when he brought it, but always paid on time. Her fingers moved out of habit, needle in, needle out, the thread pulling the cloth back into a shape it had lost through wear. Mending had taught her something about people. Damage was rarely sudden. It happened slowly, in small stresses that went unnoticed until something finally gave way. She thought of the store, of the way the room had gone still for a breath too long, of the choice she had made to turn away rather than speak. Silence had been safer. Silence had also been mistaken for agreement before. Outside, the light shifted, late afternoon turning the fields behind her house a dull gold. From this angle, Red Willow looked almost gentle, its edges softened by distance, its judgments hidden behind walls and doors. Margaret knew better. She finished the seam, tied it off neatly, and folded the shirt with care, as if attention itself might restore some balance. Tomorrow, she would deliver it and collect her pay. She would nod, say thank you, and leave before conversation found its way to her. Life would continue, because it always did. Yet as she placed the folded cloth back in her basket, she paused, her hands resting on top of it, and allowed herself one unguarded thought, brief and dangerous. She wondered how many small moments a person could endure before they became something else entirely, and whether anyone else in Red Willow had noticed that line being crossed that afternoon, or if she alone was expected to carry the weight of it into the coming days. The man who had slid the coin back across the counter was named Thomas Brewer, and in Red Willow that name carried a certain weight that had nothing to do with kindness. He owned the general store, the feed shed behind it, and a narrow slice of influence that reached farther than his property line suggested. Thomas had arrived years earlier with capital, confidence, and the ability to speak plainly about his expectations, qualities the town respected because they sounded like stability. He dressed carefully, even in the heat, sleeves rolled just enough to show he worked, but never enough to look careless, and he kept his hair trimmed in a style that suggested order rather than fashion. People said he was fair, which in Red Willow meant he rarely raised his voice and never apologized. What had happened with Margaret Hale did not register to him as cruelty. In his mind, it was correction, a reminder of how things were arranged and who benefited from that arrangement. He believed rules lost their power if they were not enforced in small ways, in moments that could be dismissed later as misunderstandings. By the time afternoon leaned toward evening, Thomas was already telling the story in a version that suited him, speaking of boundaries and policy, of the dangers of letting exceptions become habits. He laughed once while doing it, a short sound meant to signal confidence, and the men around him responded in kind, relieved to be given permission to agree. Thomas enjoyed those moments, not for the laughter itself, but for the ease with which it came. Respect, he thought, was something you cultivated by being consistent, even when that consistency hurt someone else. When he locked the store for the night, he took inventory with care, marking numbers in a ledger with precise strokes. The day had been good, business steady, order maintained. He did not consider Margaret again, except as a problem that had been handled. Outside, the street was quieter now, the heat easing as the sun lowered, and Thomas stood in the doorway for a moment, surveying what he believed he controlled. Across town, Margaret's house was invisible from here, tucked where it belonged, and that pleased him in a vague, unexamined way. He preferred things to remain where he expected them. As he turned the key and pocketed it, he noticed Ethan Caldwell's wagon passing at a distance, heading out of town. Thomas recognized the man, though they had never spoken beyond necessary exchanges. Ranchers like Caldwell were useful, predictable, and generally kept to themselves. Thomas had no opinion of him, which was the closest thing to dismissal he offered anyone. If he had looked longer, he might have noticed the way Ethan did not hurry, the way his attention seemed to rest briefly on the storefront before moving on. But Thomas was already thinking about supper, about accounts, about the quiet satisfaction of a day that confirmed his understanding of how Red Willow worked. Small acts, he believed, set examples. He did not know, and would not have believed, that examples had a way of returning, not loudly, not all at once, but in forms that could not be argued with once they arrived. Ethan Caldwell reached his ranch just as the last of the daylight thinned into a pale band along the western hills, the kind of light that did not warm anything but revealed what the day had left behind. He unhitched the wagon in practiced silence, watered the horses, and moved through the familiar sequence of tasks without hurry, letting the rhythm steady his thoughts. What he had seen in town stayed with him, not as a single image but as a series of small details that refused to settle. The angle of a returned coin, the pause before a nod, the way a room decided something together without ever speaking it aloud. Ethan had learned to trust those details. They were the pieces people overlooked when they believed nothing important had happened. He ate a simple supper, beans and bread, standing by the counter because sitting felt unnecessary, and washed his plate carefully, setting it to dry as if order in one place might balance disorder in another. Outside, the wind moved across the grass in low waves, and the night brought the quiet he preferred, a quiet that allowed thinking without interruption. He sat on the porch with a lantern beside him, not yet lit, and let the dark come on its own. Ethan did not see himself as a man meant to intervene. He had no taste for confrontation and no interest in being noticed. But he had been raised to believe that noticing was a responsibility in itself. His father had said once, while fixing a fence that refused to stay straight, that a man did not need to correct every wrong, only the ones he was positioned to correct, and that position was not always chosen. That afternoon, in Red Willow, Ethan had been positioned whether he wanted it or not. He replayed the scene again, not to justify any future action, but to understand it fully. The storekeeper had not shouted. The crowd had not jeered. That was what made it effective. It had been done in daylight, with calm voices and reasonable expressions, the kind of cruelty that asked to be excused because it looked organized. Ethan understood how such things grew. He had seen neighbors lose land that way, watched men accept smaller and smaller spaces until there was nowhere left to stand without permission. He lit the lantern and watched its circle of light settle on the porch boards, steady and contained. Tomorrow, He would go back into town to deliver a calf to a buyer who paid in cash and expected punctuality. He would pass the general store again. He would see who met his eyes and who did not. Ethan did not yet know what he would do, only what he would not do. He would not speak carelessly. He would not accuse. He would not force anyone into a corner where pride could turn stubborn. Quiet justice, he believed, required patience more than courage, a willingness to let others arrive at the truth without being dragged. Somewhere beyond the range of the lantern, the horses shifted and settled. Ethan stood, turned the light down, and went inside, carrying with him the certainty that what had begun as a small thing had not ended at all, and that the town of Red Willow would soon be asked, gently but firmly, to look at itself without the comfort of its usual explanations. The next day arrived without ceremony, the way most days did in Red Willow, carrying with it the comforting illusion that nothing had changed. Morning lights settled on the rooftops and fences, and the town moved through its habits as if habit itself were proof of innocence. The blacksmith opened his doors at the same hour. The saloon swept yesterday out into the street. The general store stood solid and sure, its windows reflecting a version of the world that appeared orderly and fair. Margaret Hale rose early, as she always did, and prepared for the day with careful efficiency. She washed, dressed, and gathered the mended shirt she planned to deliver, her movements measured and quiet. If anyone had asked, she would have said she felt fine. She did not linger over the memory of the day before, not because it had faded, but because she had learned that revisiting such moments only sharpened them. Survival, she knew, depended on restraint. When she stepped outside, the air was cool, the sky clear, and for a brief moment Red Willow looked almost welcoming. As she walked toward town, a few people nodded to her, their expressions neutral, neither kind nor unkind, and that neutrality felt like a reprieve. No one mentioned the store. No one apologized. No one asked how she was. The silence suggested that the matter had been decided and filed away, something complete and no longer worth attention. Margaret delivered the shirt, received her pay, and thanked the man who handed it to her, her voice steady, her eyes lowered just enough to avoid inviting conversation. She turned to leave before anything else could be said, before she could be reminded of where she stood. Across town, Thomas Brewer conducted his business with the same confidence as always. He greeted regulars, discussed prices, and made notes in his ledger, satisfied that the previous day had resolved itself without complication. Order, he believed, had been restored simply by continuing. To him, the absence of protest was confirmation. Ethan Caldwell arrived mid-morning with the calf he had promised, his wagon rolling into town at an unhurried pace. He exchanged brief words with the buyer, counted the bills carefully, and folded them into his pocket. He passed the general store without stopping, noting the way Thomas stood framed in the doorway, relaxed, unchallenged. They acknowledged each other with a nod that carried no meaning beyond politeness. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed that Ethan looked longer than necessary, not at the man, but at the space around him, at the ease with which the town accepted its arrangements. But no one was watching closely. By afternoon, the sense of normalcy had settled in fully, like dust after a wagon passed. People went about their lives, reassured by routine, convinced that whatever had happened was too small to matter now. Red Willow breathed out, content in the belief that quiet meant resolution. It did not recognize that this calm was not an ending, only a pause, the kind that comes before something shifts direction without warning, while everyone is busy mistaking familiarity for justice. By the third day, Red Willow began to register small irregularities, the kind that did not demand attention but unsettled those who noticed them. It started with talk that did not quite match the facts, a delivery delayed without explanation, a price adjusted downward without negotiation, a favor no longer extended where it once had been automatic. Thomas Brewer felt the first of these as a mild irritation when a supplier from the south failed to arrive on schedule, sending word instead that the wagon had been redirected to fulfill another obligation. Thomas frowned at the note, reading it twice, then folded it neatly and set it aside, telling himself such things happened. Later that morning, a rancher he had known for years asked about settling an account in cash rather than through the usual arrangement, his tone polite but firm, his eyes steady in a way that suggested a decision already made. Thomas agreed, because refusing would have required an explanation, and explanations invited questions. Across town, Margaret Hale noticed a different shift. When she passed the general store on her way home, no one called out to her, not even with the careless remarks she had grown accustomed to ignoring. The absence felt strange, not like kindness, but like restraint. At the well, a woman she barely knew offered her a brief nod and stepped aside to give her room, a small courtesy that lingered longer in Margaret's thoughts than it should have. She did not assume it meant anything. Red Willow had a way of correcting itself when expectations rose too quickly. Ethan Caldwell observed these changes from the edges, where he preferred to stand. He did not speak of them, not to Margaret, not to anyone. Instead, he moved deliberately through his usual routes, listening more than he talked, noting how often Thomas Brewer's name came up and in what context. He heard it mentioned with less certainty now, paired with phrases like perhaps and we will see. The general store remained busy, but the conversations inside it grew careful, voices lowering when Thomas approached, laughter sounding thinner, as if it had been measured first. One afternoon, a boy was sent back from the store to return a purchase, saying his father had decided to buy elsewhere after all. Thomas accepted the item with a tight smile, the kind meant to discourage further exchange, and the boy left quickly, relieved. None of this amounted to accusation. No one confronted anyone else. The town continued to function, but the ease with which it had once accepted its own decisions began to falter. People found themselves recalling the moment at the counter, the way the coin had been slid back, the silence that followed, and they remembered it not as a story but as an image that refused to fade. Thomas sensed the change without understanding its source. He reviewed his ledgers more often, checked locks twice, stood longer in his doorway at night, as if daring the town to return his gaze. He told himself that influence ebbed and flowed, that control required vigilance. What he did not tell himself was that respect, once withdrawn, rarely announced its departure. Margaret continued her routines, cautious but aware, feeling the subtle loosening of something she had once carried alone. Ethan remained where he was, neither advancing nor retreating, allowing the town to draw its own conclusions. In Red Willow, nothing dramatic had occurred, yet something unmistakable had shifted, like the first movement of ground beneath a structure that believed itself permanent, signaling not collapse, but change that could no longer be undone. On the fourth morning, Ethan Caldwell returned to Red Willow with a purpose that did not show on his face. He tied his horse near the hitching rail and walked the length of Main Street at an even pace, neither avoiding the general store nor heading straight for it, letting his presence register naturally, the way familiar things did when they belonged. He stopped first at the bank, a narrow building with a desk polished smooth by decades of elbows, and deposited the cash from his recent sale, speaking quietly with the clerk about future arrangements. He asked simple questions, the kind that required honest answers, about where funds were held, about whose signatures mattered, about how accounts were balanced when disputes arose. The clerk answered without suspicion, grateful for conversation that felt ordinary. From there, Ethan visited the feed supplier who had delayed Thomas Brewer's delivery and thanked him for honoring their agreement instead, mentioning that reliability was worth more than convenience. The man nodded, relieved, and said he preferred working with people who remembered favors without keeping score. Word traveled the way it always did, not as rumor but as confirmation, each small exchange reinforcing another. When Ethan finally entered the general store, the bell above the door announced him with unnecessary clarity. Thomas Brewer looked up from the counter, his expression settling into practiced neutrality. Ethan greeted him politely and placed an order, nothing unusual, paying in full without comment. As Thomas counted the change, Ethan said, evenly and without accusation, that he appreciated businesses that treated customers consistently, especially those who depended on credit not because they were careless, but because circumstances had narrowed their options. The words were delivered as observation, not criticism, and Thomas felt their weight precisely because they could not be argued with. He responded with something agreeable, a sentence that sounded right but meant little, and handed over the change. Ethan thanked him and left, the interaction complete. Outside, a few people who had witnessed the exchange looked at one another, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because something had been clarified. Ethan did not seek out Margaret Hale, and she did not seek him. Still, she felt the shift when she passed the store later that day and noticed Thomas's eyes follow her briefly, uncertain, before moving away. She sensed it in the way the air inside seemed tighter, more watchful. That evening, Thomas reviewed his ledger and found himself lingering over names he had once skimmed past, considering which ones might choose differently next time. He told himself he was imagining things, that business was business, and influence returned if asserted firmly enough. Yet he slept poorly, his thoughts circling around conversations that had ended too neatly. Ethan rode home as the sun lowered, satisfied not with progress, but with alignment, knowing that quiet justice required no announcement, only the careful placement of truth where it could no longer be ignored. In Red Willow, the town had begun to understand that what it had dismissed as a small moment had not disappeared at all, but had simply found its proper position, waiting there, steady and unavoidable. As the week wore on, the change that had begun as hesitation took on a shape that could no longer be mistaken for coincidence. In Red Willow, decisions were rarely made in groups, but they were often revealed that way, through a series of individual choices that leaned in the same direction. A rancher who had once taken his credit exclusively to the general store paid cash elsewhere instead. A family that relied on Thomas Brewer for staples began splitting their purchases, part here, part there, spreading loyalty the way one spread risk. No one announced these shifts. They happened quietly, each person telling themselves it was temporary, practical, or simply prudent. Thomas noticed the difference in his ledger before he felt it in his pride. Numbers that once followed predictable patterns now required explanation, and explanations came thin. He found himself offering small courtesies he had never needed before, a discount here, a longer term there, gestures meant to remind people of his usefulness. Some accepted, others thanked him politely and declined. The refusal unsettled him more than any argument could have. Across town, Margaret Hale experienced the change as a series of small allowances that felt unfamiliar. At the market, she was served promptly, without the careful delay she had come to expect. A neighbor she had never spoken to returned a borrowed tool with an apology for the wait, her tone sincere, her eyes steady. These moments did not erase what had happened, but they loosened its hold, allowing Margaret to move through the day with less tension in her shoulders. She remained cautious, knowing how quickly favor could turn, but she could not ignore the sense that the town was adjusting around her, recalibrating something it had taken for granted. Ethan Caldwell continued his routine visits, neither increasing nor withdrawing his presence, allowing others to fill in, demeaning themselves. He spoke with the same calm directness to everyone, praised reliability when he saw it, and quietly redirected his business when he did not. People listened because he never demanded they do so. His influence did not feel like influence at all, more like clarity, a way of seeing situations without the fog of habit. Thomas attempted to reassert himself one afternoon, speaking sharply to a man who questioned a charge, reminding him of how things had always been done. The words landed flat, hanging between them without the expected effect. The man listened, nodded, and said he would think about it, then left without resolving the matter. Thomas stood alone behind the counter longer than necessary, aware of the eyes that had witnessed the exchange, aware that authority, once questioned, did not return on command. That evening, Margaret walked past the general store as the sun dipped low, its light catching the glass and turning it briefly reflective. She saw herself there for a moment, standing upright, unremarkable, present. Inside, Thomas looked up, then away, and the gesture held no triumph, only acknowledgement. She continued on, her steps unhurried, feeling neither victorious nor defeated, only lighter. In Red Willow, justice was not being discussed or celebrated. It was being absorbed, one quiet adjustment at a time, as the town learned that ignoring a small cruelty had carried a cost, and that correcting it required nothing more dramatic than choosing, again and again, to do better. By the end of the second week, Thomas Brewer could no longer pretend that the change was temporary. The general store still opened on time and closed at dusk, its shelves stocked and its windows clean, but the confidence that once filled the space had thinned into something brittle. Customers came and went with polite efficiency, their conversations shorter, their decisions firmer. Where Thomas had once been the natural center of exchange, he now felt himself treated as one option among several. useful, but no longer unquestioned. The realization unsettled him because it arrived without confrontation. No one accused him of wrongdoing. No one referenced the afternoon at the counter. Instead, he found himself increasingly excluded from the small and formal arrangements that had once reinforced his standing. A shipment arrived later than expected and was smaller than promised. A banker asked for updated documentation before extending terms that had previously required only a handshake. Each request was reasonable. Taken together, they formed a quiet rebuke. Thomas responded by tightening his manner, by insisting more firmly on procedures and policies, hoping structure would restore authority. It did not. People listened, nodded, and complied where necessary, but they no longer deferred. He noticed the difference in their eyes, a careful distance where ease had once been. Across town, Margaret Hale continued her days with the same measured discipline, but the weight she carried had shifted. She was no longer alone in bearing the memory of what had happened. Others carried it now, not as guilt, but as awareness. When she entered a room, conversations no longer paused. When she spoke, she was answered. These changes were subtle enough that no one could point to them as evidence of anything. Yet they changed the texture of her life in ways she felt every hour. She did not seek acknowledgement from Thomas Brewer, and she did not receive it. What she received instead was space, the simple dignity of being allowed to exist without correction. Ethan Caldwell watched the town accept its new balance with quiet attention. He had done nothing that could be called decisive, nothing that would earn him credit or blame. He had only behaved as though consistency mattered and allowed others to notice the difference between that and control. One afternoon, he passed Thomas outside the store, and for the first time, Thomas spoke to him without certainty. He asked, casually, whether Ethan planned to continue bringing his business through Red Willow. Ethan replied that he would go where fairness made sense, and the answer contained no threat, only truth. Thomas nodded, understanding that the question itself had revealed more than it resolved. That evening, Thomas closed the store early and stood alone inside, listening to the echo of his own footsteps. He thought of the small act he had dismissed as necessary, the moment he had believed would pass unnoticed. He understood now that what he had lost was not customers or profit, but the unspoken consent that had made his authority effortless. Outside, the town moved on, unconcerned with his reflection. Margaret returned home under a softening sky, her steps unhurried. Ethan rode past the edge of town without looking back. In Red Willow, the cost of a small cruelty had finally been paid, not in punishment, but in the steady removal of the privilege that had allowed it to exist. The moment that marked the change did not arrive with witnesses or ceremony, which was fitting because Red Willow had never corrected itself loudly. It came late one afternoon when the heat had softened and the light angled low enough to reach places it usually missed. Margaret Hale walked into town with a short list folded in her pocket, not because she needed much, but because she no longer avoided spaces that had once made her careful. She moved at her usual pace, neither tentative nor defiant, simply present. The general store door stood open, the bell ready to announce her, and for a brief instant she considered turning away out of habit before recognizing that the habit no longer owned her. She stepped inside. Thomas Brewer was behind the counter, his ledger open, his pen resting between his fingers. He looked up and saw her, and the pause that followed was different from the one that had happened weeks before. This time, the silence carried no decision already made. It carried uncertainty. Thomas straightened, closed the ledger, and waited. Margaret approached the counter and placed her list down without comment. She did not mention the past. She did not explain herself. She stood as any customer would, hands relaxed, eyes level. Thomas read the list once, then again, as if making sure he understood it correctly. He gathered the items himself, setting them on the counter carefully, counting as he went. When he finished, he named a price that reflected the market, not his mood, not his authority. Margaret reached for her coin purse, but Thomas shook his head slightly and adjusted the total, subtracting a small amount without explanation. It was not an apology. It was not an attempt to regain favor. It was an acknowledgement, offered quietly, without performance. Margaret nodded once, accepting the change without comment, because dignity did not require speeches. She paid, took her parcel, and turned to leave. As she did, she met Thomas's eyes briefly, long enough for both of them to understand that whatever had been decided between them was complete. Outside, the street moved on, unaware that anything meaningful had occurred. A wagon passed. A door closed. Somewhere down the block, someone laughed. Ethan Caldwell stood across the way, waiting for his horse to be brought out from the stable. He saw Margaret exit the store and continue down the street with her head held as it always had been, steady and unremarkable. He saw Thomas return to his ledger and resume his work with a posture that had lost its sharpness. Nothing about the scene invited attention. That was its power. No one gathered. No one spoke. Yet the town felt it, the way people feel a shift in weather before they can name it. Red Willow had reached the point where the quiet adjustments of the past weeks settled into something permanent. Margaret walked home beneath a sky turning pale, her steps even, her thoughts unburdened by the need to interpret every glance. Ethan mounted his horse and rode out without looking back, satisfied not because he had changed the town, but because he had not allowed it to remain unchanged. In that small exchange at a wooden counter, justice had arrived exactly as it always did when it lasted, unnoticed by most, undeniable to those it concerned, and complete without ever raising its voice. In the days that followed, Red Willow did not speak of what had happened, and that silence felt different from the one that had preceded it. It was no longer a silence of avoidance, but of acceptance, as if the town had quietly agreed that the matter required no further explanation. Margaret Hale noticed the change most clearly in herself. She still rose early, still measured her days by work completed rather than attention received, but the constant calculation she had carried began to loosen. She no longer rehearsed her words before entering a room or counted the seconds before someone might remind her of her place. When she walked through town, she walked as she always had, only now the ground beneath her steps felt steady rather than conditional. She did not mistake this for kindness. She understood it as recognition, something earned not through demand, but through endurance that had finally been witnessed. At her table in the evenings, she allowed herself to sit a little longer after supper, hands folded, listening to the quiet without bracing against it. Across town, Thomas Brewer adjusted to a narrower version of his authority. He remained a businessman, respected where respect was still due, but the ease with which others had once deferred to him did not return. He learned, gradually and without comment, which gestures were now necessary and which were no longer effective. The town did not punish him. It simply declined to excuse him further. This adjustment unsettled him at first, then settled into something resembling clarity. He began to understand that influence held without consideration was fragile, and that the moment he had dismissed as insignificant had revealed more about him than he had intended. He carried that understanding quietly, because there was nowhere to set it down. Ethan Caldwell returned to his routines beyond the edge of town, his days marked by weather, work, and the slow, honest changes of the land. He did not receive thanks, and he did not expect it. He had not acted to be seen. When he passed through Red Willow, people greeted him as they always had, with brief nods and unremarkable exchanges, yet something in their manner suggested alignment rather than curiosity. They spoke plainly around him, as if pretense would not hold. Ethan accepted this without comment, knowing that the truest measure of influence was how little it needed to announce itself. He did not consider the matter resolved in a dramatic sense, because life rarely offered such conclusions. What mattered was that the town had learned something it could not unlearn. Small acts, he knew, did not remain small when they were allowed to stand. Neither did small corrections. Margaret and Ethan crossed paths once more on a quiet afternoon, passing each other near the well without stopping. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment there was no gratitude, no shared secret, only mutual recognition of something set right. They continued on, each to their own lives, carrying forward the same restraint that had guided them before, now lightened by the absence of a burden that no longer belonged to either of them. Red Willow remained what it was, imperfect and weathered, but altered in a way that could not be undone. The town had absorbed a lesson without instruction, and those who lived there moved on, changed not by noise or force, but by the steady weight of quiet justice settling into place. Years later, people in Red Willow would remember that season without agreeing on why it mattered. Some would say it was when the town grew steadier, when business felt fairer and conversation simpler. Others would recall it only as a time when nothing remarkable seemed to happen at all. The truth lived somewhere between those recollections, carried quietly by the few who understood that lasting change rarely announced itself. Margaret Hale continued her life much as before, her days shaped by work and care, her house still facing the open land where the grass bent with the wind. Yet there was a difference she felt each morning when she stepped outside and met the day without rehearsing for it. She spoke when she needed to speak and remained silent when silence suited her, not because either was safer, but because both were now her choice. The town did not elevate her, and she did not seek elevation. What she gained was simpler and more durable, the freedom to move through her own life without being measured by someone else's impatience. Thomas Brewer remained in Red Willow as well, his store still standing, his name still known. He learned, slowly and without bitterness, how to conduct himself in a place that no longer confused firmness with fairness. The town did not forget what he had done, but it did not define him by it either. Instead, it held him to a standard that no longer bent for convenience, and over time, he adapted, discovering that respect earned through consistency was quieter but more secure than the kind he had once enforced. Ethan Caldwell was rarely mentioned in connection with any of it, which suited him. He continued to ranch his land beyond the edge of town, coming in when necessary and leaving without fanfare. When he passed through Red Willow, people treated him as they always had, with courtesy that asked nothing and owed nothing. He did not correct their understanding, because the work had never been about recognition. It had been about alignment, about choosing not to look away when looking mattered. On one clear evening, as the sun settled low and the long shadows returned to the street, Margaret stood at the edge of town and watched Ethan ride past on his way home. They did not stop or speak. They did not need to. The space between them held everything that required acknowledgement. Red Willow continued on, weathered and imperfect, its buildings aging, its people changing in small, uneven ways. But the lesson that had settled there remained, carried forward not as a story told aloud, but as a habit quietly practiced. In that town, people learned that cruelty did not need to be large to be costly, and that justice did not need noise to endure. It only required one person to remain steady when it would have been easier to turn away, and another to keep walking with dignity even when the ground beneath her felt uncertain. Out on the plains, the wind moved on as it always had, indifferent and constant, and Red Willow stood beneath it, altered not by force, but by the simple, lasting weight of doing what was right and letting that be enough.